After nearly 2 decades, a deeper look into the investigation explores a killer's disturbing history of violence.
I lifted the lid of the trash can, and the odor was the unmistakable smell of death,
leading to the discovery of even more heinous crimes.
They found a adult male body, chopped multiple times in the back.
He had a bag over his face. This was an undeniable pattern.
And new interviews examine the motives that drove them to commit such unspeakable acts.
She attacked her because she hated her.
She was collecting those Social Security payments for about 2.5 years.
Leading to shocking new developments from behind bars.
Something unbelievable happened at the state prison.
She is cunning, sneaky, and I would not be surprised if she tries it again.
February 5th, 2001. At approximately 1:30 p.m., police in Las Vegas, Nevada receive an ominous call from the manager of a storage facility.
The concern that the storage unit manager had is that there had been numerous complaints of a foul odor emanating from somewhere in the storage facility. They said the odor was the unmistakable smell of death.
When officers arrive on the scene, the manager takes them to the storage unit in question.
The moment they rolled up the door, they're hit with a pungent scent of decaying flesh.
When they got in, they found a canister, a large garbage pail, like what you roll out to the curb at your house.
There was plastic wrap around the top of the trash receptacle, as well as duct tape.
They did a presumptive test for blood, which came back positive. That in turn led the authorities to pursue a telephonic search warrant, which would allow them to legally cut open the can.
Inside, I saw a human being in an advanced state of decomposition.
I've never seen one like that in my life. It was a terrible way to entomb someone after death.
They could not really tell how long the body had been there, because this body basically was sealed in this contained environment for who knows how long.
Cause of death is impossible to determine, but the circumstances suggest foul play.
They noticed that there was a bag that appeared to be tied around this person's face.
Somebody had taken great care and pain and effort in order to try to seal this garbage can. It certainly was done by an individual that did not want this body to be discovered.
I found a wallet with a driver's license in the name of Christine M. Smith in a plastic bag in the unit.
They learned that this particular unit was leased out and rented out to a woman named Brookey West, who was Christine Smith's daughter.
Our initial belief is that the deceased person in the trash can was Brookey West's mother, but we didn't know. We had to confirm that. We needed to locate Brookey West to see what she had to say about the situation, to see what she knew.
For both Christine and Brookey, life had always been a challenge.
Christine Smith grew up in a rural Texas town, and her father was a truck driver. Her mom was a stay-at-home mother, And things started to go south for Christine at an early age.
From the way she talked about her life, she had one traumatic experience after another.
In 1947, Christine met an El Paso man named Leroy Smith.
Smith was somebody who just came out of the military. He was now looking for a job and to start his own family. And Christine Smith and Leroy, they caught each other's eye, and, eventually they got married.
Leroy joined the police force, and the couple had 2 children, Brookey and a son named Travis.
At first, it seemed like this was a dream come true for Christine. But over time, she would find herself in an abusive relationship.
Her husband, even though he worked for the police, was not law-abiding.
He was a known white supremacist, and he also became very interested in the occult and Satanism. At one point, Leroy left Christine for a cocktail waitress.
Leroy took the children, sending Christine into a downward spiral. She began an affair of her own with a married man named David.
She fell madly in love with him, and over time realized that she'd been bamboozled, that he had no intention of leaving his wife, and that he was just using Christine for sex. She asked to meet him at a bar. The man showed up, sat down. Christine pulled out a shotgun and shot him at point-blank range.
I was like, oh my God, how could you do that? She said, he discarded me. I was angry at having been treated like garbage.
Christine was quickly arrested after shooting her lover. She ended up getting a sentence of 14 years for an attempt murder charge.
However, Christine was paroled after serving only 2 years of her sentence. Upon her release, she was determined to turn her life around.
Christine comes out. She reunites with Leroy, and she comes back looking for her children.
However, 9-year-old Brookey and 6-year-old Travis were now living under state-sponsored care.
Once Christine was incarcerated, Leroy Smith decided he didn't want anything to do with his kids anymore and dropped them off at an orphanage. One day, they got a huge surprise. Leroy showed up at the orphanage with Christine. She had recently been released from prison, and Leroy and Christine took the kids back.
Leroy moves the whole family to California.
After high school, Brookey briefly enlisted in the Army before transitioning to a career in technology.
Well, during the military, Brookey learned a lot of skills, and it was in that time period when computers became more and more prevalent. She has innate ability to understand coding, numbers, very detailed information that she's able to memorize and maintain.
Over the next 2 decades, Brookey found great success in the field of technical writing.
A technical writer is someone who produces documents. You might write a manual on how to install a computer program.
Life was pretty good. She was able to buy a house in Los Banos, California.
But her mother had some problems. Her mother had been sick one occasion, and she would take care of her mother. She would move back and forth between Las Vegas and San Francisco for work, so she kept residences both places.
My understanding is that Brookey moved her mom to Las Vegas because it was a lot cheaper at the time than living in California. There was activity that Christine liked. She enjoyed being close to the casinos.
Brookey split her time between the 2 states until 1997, when the 44-year-old permanently relocated to Las Vegas to live with her 65-year-old mother. The pair settled into a happy rhythm. But 4 years later, their reunion has ended in tragedy. A decomposed body has been discovered hidden in a storage unit rented by Brookey. And investigators want to know who it belongs to.
The can with the body inside was transported to the Clark County Coroner's Office, and a very unusual autopsy unfolded. They took the can and basically tipped it upside down and poured the contents out onto a gurney.
Absolutely liquefied body that was probably the first and only case that's come through here.
There was insect larvae, maggots, that were on and around the body. And the authorities collected many samples of these insects.
The cause and manner of death was unknown. There was nothing obvious, no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, none of the things you might associate with some kind of violent event.
The victim's teeth are intact, allowing the coroner to use dental records to positively ID the body as Christine Smith. One mystery has been solved, but more arise when detectives take a closer look at the items in the storage unit.
There were books dealing with witchcraft, books dealing with black magic, books dealing with Satanism, and things of that nature.
The crime scene itself was so unusual and so bizarre that you can't help but ask, could these be related? Could this involve Satanism, witchcraft, occult behavior?
Coming up, investigators dig into Christine and Brookey's past.
Some days you thought that they loved each other dearly, and other days you thought they hated each other.
And they uncover a second mysterious death.
There appeared to be a bag over the victim's face.
Detectives in Las Vegas, Nevada are investigating the disturbing death of 68-year-old Christine Smith. It's a crime scene unlike any they've ever encountered.
Of course, Las Vegas has a real dark side to it. But the idea of finding a garbage can with a body in it in a storage shed and books about witchcraft and Satanism, I mean, their minds were spinning as to what could possibly explain this.
Her daughter, Brookey West, is the first person they need to speak with.
They had a lot of questions regarding Christine Smith. First and foremost, how did she die? But the bigger question was, how did she get in that garbage can? And why is she in a storage unit that came back to Brookey West?
When police check Christine's last known address, they discover it was also leased to Brookey.
The two homicide detectives ended up getting a search warrant and going to her apartment.
They knock on the door and Brookey Lee West is not there. They went inside and started looking around. Clearly a nice apartment, lots of nice belongings in there.
There was not a lot of furniture in there, but clearly it had been occupied.
It appears that only Brookey had been living there. Investigators also find several pieces of suspicious evidence.
We found duct tape. We found what we believe to be the key to the lock for the storage room that Christine's body was in.
When they did a forensic analysis on that duct tape, they found that it was a perfect match to the duct tape that had been wrapped around the garbage can. Investigators then started to really take a close look at the paperwork that they found in the apartment, specifically bank records. They noticed that Brookey Lee West was collecting money, Social Security, that was supposed to go to her mother. And it made for a very suspicious circumstance and a likely scenario that Brookey was involved in her mother's death.
They speak to Christine and Brookey's neighbors to try to shed light on their relationship. What they learn is eye-opening.
Some days you thought that they loved each other dearly, and other days you thought they hated each other.
I didn't really want to get involved at all, so Sandy told me a couple things about him every once in a while.
They had this kind of double-edged relationship. They would fight, they would be at odds with one another. It was a back and forth kind of up and down situation.
According to Christine's friends, the source of the conflict dated back to Brookey's childhood. Christine's own upbringing had left scars and poor boundaries for raising her daughter.
It seemed like Christine was very dysfunctional, and she needed Brookey for that dysfunction.
Christine basically taught Brookey how to be a criminal. When she was a child, they became shoplifters and swindlers and grifters, and so this was Brookey's role model. Growing up, it became apparent to Brookey that she needed to get away from her mother, so she decided to join the Army.
When the two reunited and began living together, the dynamic between them seemed to flip. Now, 44-year-old Brookey was the one in control.
When she offered to take care of her mother, she made it clear there were limitations. Christine was not allowed to have visitors to their home. She was not allowed to talk about what went on in their home or about her relationship with Brooke or anyone else.
In approximately January or February of 1998, Christine just seemed to fall off the face of the earth. When Christine's friends started to inquire about what happened, they started asking Brookey Lee West, where's your mother?
What Brooke had told everyone is that she had been taken to live with her brother Travis.
The neighbors thought it was suspicious because she had heard Travis was severely mentally ill, that he was not able to take care of himself, that he was walking the streets and was homeless.
It just didn't make any sense at all, and they quickly concluded that this was all a big lie. She had not been seen since nearly 3 years prior to the discovery of her body.
To investigators, the news seems to confirm their suspicions about Brookey's involvement.
Well, about an hour after they left her apartment, the manager called and said that Brookey West had returned to the apartment, but had left. And the manager had a description of her vehicle.
At one point, they do in fact spot Brookey driving in her truck, and she is pulled over and taken into custody and arrested on a charge of murder for the killing of her mother.
The only thing that Brooke ever told the police was, my mom died of natural causes.
According to Brookey, she found her mother dead in 1999.
She claimed that she simply panicked and decided to dispose of her mother in the garbage can.
News of the horrific crime scene and Brookey's arrest seizes headlines across the country.
The circumstances were so unusual that it drew a lot of attention. And that media coverage made its way to California. Las Vegas police learned that Christine Smith wasn't the first person close to Brookey Lee West who had died under suspicious circumstances. A detective in California reached out to the Las Vegas detectives to let them know that, hey, just a few years earlier, Brookey Lee West was my prime suspect in her husband's murder.
After learning that Brookey West was connected to a previous homicide, Las Vegas investigators asked their counterparts in California to walk them through the details of that unsolved case.
On June 6, 1994, Tulare County Sheriff's Department received a 911 call from a tourist who was visiting the Sequoia National Forest. This individual who was picnicking with his family discovered the body of a male that was found on the side of the road.
Officers responded, and it was clear that this was a homicide, and there appeared to be a bag over the victim's face. They looked for any signs of a weapon and couldn't find anything.
There did not appear to be any foul play around the location.
They quickly concluded that the victim had been shot elsewhere and that this was actually a dump site. Fingerprints were taken from the deceased, and they soon found out that their victim was a man named Howard Simon St. John.
The body of Howard St. John was transported to the coroner's office for further analysis.
Authorities looked at the condition of the body, and they were able to determine that he had died relatively recently, within the last 12 to 24 hours.
Howard St. John had been shot multiple times in the back. Either he was running away in fear for his life, or he was completely shot by surprise.
They also uncovered an interesting clue, which was a .32 caliber bullet was lodged in his neck, and it appeared to be from a separate shooting. It did not appear to be related to his death. Howard had been shot in a separate incident, and he survived.
Based on the limited amount of healing from that earlier gunshot wound, the coroner believed it happened just a few weeks prior.
They learned that Howard had a significant record involving petty crimes, mostly involving alcohol abuse.
He was from a tough side of town in the San Jose Bay Area, San Francisco. He had been in and out of jail. And they also learned a very important fact, which was he was in a very tumultuous marriage with a woman by the name of Brookey Lee West.
Investigators contacted Howard's family to learn more about his marriage and his life.
What they learned was that Howard Simon St. John was born in May 1958 to Sylvester and Catherine St. John in Redwood City, California. They traced him to a nearby Tulare County Indian reservation. He had a history there, grew up there, and wanted to explore his Native American roots. He'd been there for many years and had at one point a stable family life early on. But, over time, Howard struggled with alcohol and drugs and ended up homeless.
After several years struggling with addiction, Howard's friends got him into a shelter and he started Alcoholics Anonymous. He and Brookey met at one of the meetings in the spring of 1994.
Brookey West was attending these AA meetings not because she was an alcoholic, but she was actually bringing her elderly mom, Christine Smith. And she suddenly started eyeing Howard St. John.
She appeared to be well off, well-dressed, beautiful woman who was very successful.
He showed up in T-shirts, unkempt clothing, did not seem to have any money, and those are two people that you would not have expected to see get together. But a relationship blossomed. Next thing you know, Howard St. John is telling everyone that he was moving into Brookey's home.
Within a matter of a month or two, they ended up going to Reno, eloping, and getting married in Nevada.
In this investigation that I received from the Tulare County Sheriff's Department, there was a notation about the first domestic violence that occurred about 2 weeks prior to Howard's death. On May 21st, about a month after they got married, there had been an altercation and domestic violence situation, and Brookey used a firearm to shoot at Howard. He was shot in the neck.
So on June 9th, 1994, investigators went to their home in California to question her about his death.
You have a prior domestic dispute involving gun violence, and then a few weeks after that, Howard turns up dead. So it would be logical for the authorities to really scrutinize this relationship.
Coming up, an unsolved death sheds light on the current murder investigation.
I was surprised and kind of eerily seeing similarities.
And detectives try to bring a remorseless killer to justice.
This case was about greed, hatred, selfishness.
After Brookey Lee West emerged as the prime suspect in the investigation into her husband's murder, California investigators went to their home to question her. A woman answered the door, but it wasn't Brookey. It was her 62-year-old mother, Christine Smith.
When the authorities talked to Christine Smith, she had very negative things to say about Howard Simon St. John. She said that he was a bum, that he drank all the time, he didn't work, and that, frankly, her exact words were, he's as crazy as a bedbug.
Nobody understood his purpose in Brooke's life. He didn't appear to have any job because he would be at home whenever she was gone to work. In comparison to Brooke, he was a slob.
She said he had a long-term alcohol problem and had a history of being violent with Brooke.
In the process, too, she started talking about the incident that happened 2 weeks prior.
She said that Brookey had accidentally put Howard's wallet and identification through the wash, and that they had been arguing about this, and that Howard was acting violently.
She reached for a gun and fired in self-defense.
It was a miracle that Howard even survived the gunshot. He had been shot in the neck at very close range.
Brookey was charged in the shooting incident, but the case was dismissed.
After the shooting, Howard told the authorities he didn't want her prosecuted. He wanted them to drop the charges. Against advice from his family, his friends, and everyone else, he quickly reunited with Brookey.
Christine told them she didn't know why Brookey decided to take Howard back after his recovery. Detectives were interested in asking Brookey the same question. And before the interview with Christine was over, they got their chance.
Suddenly, Brookey West came home. She was very charismatic and open and willing to talk to detectives.
Brookey Lee West told a very similar story to her mother, which was that she had shot him in self-defense. So those two accounts aligned with one another.
She kind of painted the picture that she had a very soft heart for him, that she loved him. She wanted to have that relationship succeed.
But according to Brookey, Howard seemed to have other plans.
After things had calmed down, Brookey worked that whole weekend before returning to Los Baños and learned that Howard was no longer there and had stolen $3,000 from her.
She said he had taken that money and gone with some associates to Reno and gambled that money away.
Brookey claimed she never saw her husband again. At the time, California investigators could not confirm her alibi, but without direct evidence of her involvement, they moved on to other possible suspects.
Howard had a record of having individuals that he wronged over his lifetime, and so they wanted to continue to see if there were any other potential persons of interest that they wanted to talk to.
They were very, very meticulous about this case. They assembled hundreds of interviews. They really did their homework, but the case just never came together.
That case file sat with the Tulare County Sheriff's Department for many months, going into years, as unsolved.
But 7 years later, Las Vegas detectives wonder if Brookey is responsible for the deaths of both her mother and her former husband.
Now, you've got two dead bodies of people that are closely associated with Brooke.
I was surprised and kind of eerily seeing similarities with what happened to Christine Smith and with what happened to Howard St. John.
Howard had a bag over his face, and so did Christine Smith. This was an undeniable pattern.
Now we have to look at Christine's death and find enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Brookey West killed her mom.
While there is no statute of limitations on murder, the evidence isn't strong enough to charge Brookey Lee West in connection to the murder of Howard St. John. Crime scene technicians combed through the storage unit looking for any other evidence to tie Brookey to Christine's murder.
They did a very extensive examination of the cellophane and duct tape around the garbage can.
To my amazement, the crime scene investigator was able to find and recover a fingerprint that was on the inside of the plastic cellophane wrapping.
When they did an analysis of that fingerprint, they found out that it was Brookey Lee West's print.
That was a pretty good indication to us that Brookey at least had some hand in sealing the trash can.
I think that one day Brookey just snapped and attacked her mother because she hated her. She hated all the childhood trauma that she had been put through. She'd never had stability in her life, and Christine was going to pay the price for it.
Brookey West is a diabolical individual. She didn't have a good relationship with her mom. She decided to kill her, and she was collecting those Social Security payments for about 2.5 years until she was discovered.
This case was about greed, hatred, and selfishness.
The fingerprint is a solid piece of evidence, but as Brookey's trial date approaches, prosecutors wonder if it will be enough to convict her.
Did I feel comfortable going to trial the way it is? Absolutely not. How do I prove to a jury that this was done by criminal means with criminal intent?
On July 3rd, 2001, 5 months after Christine Smith's body was discovered, her daughter, Brookey Lee West, stands trial for murder.
A lot of cases you've got a murder weapon. A lot of cases you might have a confession. They didn't have any of that with Brookey.
Could Brookey have just simply panicked and disposed of her mother's body but didn't kill her?
The defense presented the idea that the body may have had some natural disease that no longer is viewable, and I had to concede that that was possible.
But the prosecution argues that a crucial detail about the crime scene proves Brookey's claim to be false.
There would be no reason to put a bag over someone's face if you just panicked.
I have a theory about all that. It's based on the Satanic Bible. I read it in order to see if there was a connection. By placing something over their eyes, that person is damned forever to be stuck in their own demons.
They bolster their case with the expert testimony of a forensic entomologist.
You would expect that within minutes, if not within the hour, blowflies would have colonized the body. But we don't have the blowflies. That gave an indication that Brookey must have had the garbage can ready, the cellophane wrapping ready, and the duct tape ready. The lack of blowflies suddenly gave me the option to, based on science, to argue that this was premeditated.
The body most likely went into this can very shortly after it died, or possibly even when it was still alive.
On July 19th, 2001, the jury delivers its verdict.
The jury took just 2 hours to convict Brookey Lee West of first-degree murder. Brookey Lee West was sentenced to life in prison without parole.
I absolutely feel that justice was served in this case. She did it, and she needs to suffer the consequences.
There are certain crimes that, are beyond the pale, and this was certainly one of them.
How can anybody do that? Especially your own daughter, murder her mother that way? Shocking, really, even now.
6 years after the verdict, Brookey's case is featured on the 5th season of Snapped. But her story doesn't end there.
Nearly 10 years after Brookey Lee West was convicted of murder, something unbelievable happened at the state prison where Brookey was serving her life sentence.
July 20th, 2012. Brookey Lee West has been incarcerated since 2001, when she was convicted of murdering her mother, Christine Smith.
So, Brookey's housed at Florence McClure Women's Facility in North Las Vegas. It's the prison for the state of Nevada for female prisoners. Brookey was by and large a model prisoner. She taught art classes. She was involved in pen pal groups, all kinds of things to try to be productive even though she was in prison. I think the structure of prison suited Brookey fairly well.
11 years after her conviction, it's Friday morning visiting day, and most inmates are preparing to see family members. But Brookey is occupied with something else.
Brookey had taken some art supplies and hid some art supplies. She managed to dye her hair, and she managed to store away some clothes from a guard.
She had changed her clothes and made her way all the way to the front entry of the prison and was on the verge of walking out.
She was able to get through multiple checkpoints and was just stopped at the last one. She almost made it, but she was arrested trying to walk out the front door of Florence McClure.
She's now housed in a maximum security facility. Now she's no longer in the Nevada Women's Correctional Facility. Brookey West is very crafty. She is cunning, sneaky, and I would not be surprised if she tries it again.
The story surrounding Brookey Lee West and her exploits have made her one of the most notorious killers in Las Vegas history. And while she remains in jail for the gruesome murder of her mother, authorities were never able to prove Brookey was responsible for the death of her husband.
She was a professional, high-income, attractive woman, a technical writer, someone that you would never, ever think was capable of this type of violence. But behind the facade was a very dangerous human being. The people who were close to Brookey were traumatized beyond belief by this whole series of events. And they just cumulatively came to learn that they were in the presence of a predator.
Howard St. John was in the wrong place in the wrong time with the wrong person.
Christine was colorful. She was chaotic. She was troubled. She was friendly. She was funny. We should remember Christine as a victim, despite all her flaws.
I really felt bad for Christine. Really, the whole thing, She never deserved that at all.
I loved Christine. She was uniquely her, but everybody has good qualities and bad qualities, and I can accept them as they are. We all have good and bad in us. No one deserves to die at the hands of a murderer. No one.
The air inside the storage facility in Las Vegas that afternoon felt strangely heavier than it should have, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It was February 5th, 2001, and nothing about the day suggested it would become the kind of story people would still whisper about years later, the kind of case detectives would struggle to categorize even after decades of experience. The manager had noticed it first, the way you notice something wrong before you can explain it. A sourness drifting through the rows of locked metal doors, growing stronger each day until it became impossible to ignore. At first, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe a dead animal somewhere in the ventilation, maybe spoiled trash left behind by a careless tenant, but deep down he already knew this wasn't normal. When he finally called police, his voice carried that tight uncertainty that comes when instinct overrides logic, when you are no longer asking if something is wrong, but how wrong it might be. Officers arrived expecting a routine inspection, the kind that usually ends with a forgotten bag of garbage or damp cardboard, but the moment they stepped inside the corridor, their expectations collapsed. The smell hit them like a physical force, dense and unmistakable, the kind of odor that no training manual can prepare you for because it is not just unpleasant, it is final. It speaks of time and concealment, and something that was never meant to be found. Following the manager down the narrow aisle, they stopped in front of a storage unit that looked ordinary at first glance. No sign of forced entry, no visible disturbance, just another anonymous metal door among dozens. But it was coming from behind that door that the air seemed to thicken, and when they finally got it open, the world inside shifted into something far darker than expected. There, in the dim light of the unit, sat a large plastic garbage can, the kind you would normally see rolled to a curb on a quiet suburban morning, but this one was sealed in a way that immediately erased any sense of normalcy. Thick layers of plastic wrap and duct tape had been carefully wound around its top, not hastily, not in panic, but with deliberate, methodical precision. It was the kind of sealing that did not suggest disposal, but containment, as if someone had not wanted something thrown away, but hidden from existence itself. Even before anyone touched it, the weight of what might be inside pressed against them, an unspoken certainty that something had ended here. A preliminary test confirmed what their senses had already told them, the presence of biological material consistent with decomposition, and from that moment the investigation transformed from a welfare check into something far more serious, something irreversible. A telephonic warrant was quickly secured, and when the can was finally opened under controlled conditions, the scene inside forced even seasoned investigators into silence. What they saw was not just a body, but what time and confinement had done to it, an advanced state of decomposition contained within plastic walls that had turned the can into a sealed environment of decay. There was no immediate way to determine identity, no simple narrative of what had happened, only fragments of evidence that suggested an attempt to ensure the contents would never be discovered. A bag had been placed over the face, tightly secured, adding another layer of deliberate concealment, as if even recognition itself had been denied. The effort involved was unmistakable, not random violence, but something more controlled, more intentional, as though the person responsible had understood exactly what they were doing and why. Inside the storage unit, scattered items added to the unease, personal belongings, papers, and strange objects that seemed disconnected at first, but would later form a disturbing pattern. Among them were books on occult practices, texts referencing witchcraft and dark rituals, objects that, when placed alongside the sealed container, created an atmosphere that felt almost ritualistic in its precision. Investigators at the scene did not yet have answers, but they had something perhaps more important at the beginning of any major case: direction. The unit was rented under a name that led them immediately to a woman named Brookey West, and with that single link, the investigation gained its first focal point. But what made the case even more unsettling was not just the condition of the remains or the objects surrounding them, but the realization that the victim had been living under the care of someone who should have protected her. When dental records confirmed the identity of the deceased as Christine Smith, a 68-year-old woman, the case shifted again, now transforming from an anonymous tragedy into a deeply personal one. Christine was not a stranger pulled from the margins of society. She was a mother, a woman whose life history would soon reveal layers of turbulence that stretched back decades. And the only immediate connection to her final resting place was her own daughter. As detectives began tracing the timeline backward, they discovered that Christine's life had been marked by instability, violence, and cycles of loss that seemed to repeat across generations. Her early years in Texas, her marriage to a man who would later reveal darker affiliations, her struggles with abandonment and incarceration, all painted a picture of a life shaped by circumstances that rarely offered stability. Yet even within that turbulent history, nothing immediately explained how she ended up sealed inside a garbage can in a Las Vegas storage unit. Brookey West, her daughter, became the center of attention almost instantly, not because she was initially considered guilty, but because she was the only person who could possibly answer the questions forming in the minds of investigators. Where was she? When had she last seen her mother? And perhaps most importantly, what had happened in the years leading up to this moment that could explain such a discovery? But Brookey was not easily located, and in her absence, investigators began doing what they always do in the earliest hours of an unexplained death. They looked at the life behind the victim. Neighbors described Christine and Brookey as a pair defined by contradiction, moments of apparent closeness followed by sudden tension, a relationship that seemed to oscillate between dependency and resentment without ever settling into stability. Some remembered laughter between them, shared routines, the quiet familiarity of two women living under the same roof. Others remembered raised voices, boundaries that shifted without warning, an emotional landscape that never stayed consistent long enough to understand. To those observing from the outside, it was a relationship that never fully revealed itself, always partially hidden behind closed doors and half-finished explanations. As detectives expanded their search, financial records introduced a new layer of suspicion. Social Security payments intended for Christine appeared to have been redirected, collected over an extended period, raising questions about control, access, and motive. The idea that someone might have been benefiting financially from Christine's absence added weight to the growing theory that this was not a sudden act, but something more sustained, something planned. Yet even with these leads, certainty remained elusive. The storage unit itself offered contradictions, signs of care in concealment, but chaos in explanation. Nothing was straightforward, and every answer seemed to generate another question. What was clear, however, was that Christine Smith had not simply disappeared. She had been placed there, deliberately, in a way that suggested time had been used as a tool of concealment. And somewhere in Las Vegas, Her daughter Brookey West held the missing piece of a story that was already beginning to feel far larger than a single act of violence. Las Vegas in the late 1990s had a particular kind of duality that people who lived there often recognized but rarely articulated out loud. On one side, it was a city of light, constant motion, and reinvention, where anonymity was easy and reinvention even easier. On the other, it carried a quiet undercurrent of displacement, people who had arrived with intentions of starting over but found themselves instead circling the same patterns they had tried to escape. Christine Smith and her daughter Brookey West arrived in this environment not as newcomers chasing dreams, but as two people already carrying the weight of histories that had never fully left them behind. By the time they settled into life together in Las Vegas in the late 1990s, both women had already lived through decades marked by instability, fractured relationships, and emotional survival rather than emotional peace. Their reunion was, on paper, a return to family, but in practice it became something far more complicated, a merging of two lives that had already been shaped by dysfunction in different ways. Christine's earlier years had been defined by volatility that seemed to follow her from one chapter to the next. Growing up in rural Texas, she had experienced hardship early, in a household where stability was fragile and emotional safety was never guaranteed. Those formative years left her with a worldview that did not easily trust permanence, and when she met Leroy Smith, a man with military background who had recently transitioned into law enforcement, it initially seemed like an opportunity for structure and order to enter her life. Their marriage, at first glance, appeared conventional, even hopeful. They had children together, Brookey and her brother Travis, and for a brief period there was the sense of a family trying to establish itself. But beneath that surface, fractures began to appear in ways that would later define everything that followed. Leroy Smith was not the stable figure his profession might have suggested. According to later accounts, his personal life diverged sharply from the expectations of his public role. Allegations of extremist ideology and fascination with occult beliefs painted a picture of a household where instability was not only present but normalized. For Christine, the marriage became less about partnership and more about endurance. And when Leroy eventually left the family, taking the children with him, Christine was left in a psychological freefall that would shape her decisions for years to come. That period marked the beginning of a long pattern in Christine's life where emotional abandonment and reactive choices began to define her behavior. In the aftermath of losing custody of her children, she entered into relationships that were driven less by stability and more by emotional need. One of those relationships, with a married man named David, would later become a turning point in ways that would permanently alter the trajectory of her life. According to accounts from that time, the relationship began with the same intensity that often accompanies emotional dependency, a rapid sense of attachment that blurred boundaries and expectations. But when Christine realized she was not the only focus of David's life, something inside her shifted in a way that those close to her would later describe as a breaking point. The confrontation that followed was not calm or measured. It ended in violence, a moment that would result in her arrest and a conviction for attempted murder. She served time in prison, a relatively short sentence in comparison to the severity of the charge, but the experience left a permanent mark on her identity. When she was released after 2 years, Christine did not return as the same person she had been before incarceration. She returned with a sense of determination, or at least the appearance of it, and a desire to rebuild her relationship with her children. But time had already done its work. Brookey and her brother Travis had spent their formative years in state care, and their emotional connection to their mother had become complicated by absence, confusion, and inconsistency. When Christine re-entered their lives, it was not a simple reunion. It was a reintroduction between people who shared biology, but not necessarily trust. Eventually, the family was reunited under unstable circumstances, with Christine and Leroy briefly re-establishing contact before relocating the children to California. That move marked another attempt at normalcy, but again, the foundation was fragile. Brookey, now growing into adolescence, began to develop her own identity in an environment that was still shaped by her parents' unresolved history. Unlike her mother, Brookey demonstrated early signs of analytical thinking and technical aptitude. She was precise, detail-oriented, and capable of absorbing complex information with unusual ease. Those traits would later become the foundation of her career in technical writing, a field that rewarded clarity and structure, two things that had been absent from much of her early life. As she transitioned into adulthood, Brookey found a sense of independence through education and professional development, eventually serving briefly in the military before moving into civilian technical work. By most external measures, she had achieved stability that contrasted sharply with her upbringing. She owned property, maintained employment, and built a life that appeared organized and self-sufficient. But beneath that structure, her relationship with her mother remained a constant variable, something that could not be fully resolved or removed. Christine, now older and increasingly dependent, began to rely on Brookey not just emotionally but practically. Their cohabitation in Las Vegas in the late 1990s was as much a logistical decision as it was a familial one. The cost of living, combined with Christine's preference for certain environments, led Brookey to relocate her mother to Nevada, where they shared a residence that would eventually become the center of a criminal investigation. Those who observed them during this period described a relationship that was difficult to categorize. At times, there appeared to be genuine affection between them, shared routines and moments of familiarity that suggested normalcy. At other times, tension would surface in subtle but noticeable ways, shifts in tone, changes in control, and boundaries that seemed unclear or inconsistently enforced. To outsiders, it was difficult to determine who held influence in the relationship. What became clear over time was that the dynamic between mother and daughter was not static. It shifted depending on circumstance, need, and emotional state, creating a system that lacked clear stability. Christine, who had once been the dominant figure in Brookey's childhood, appeared increasingly dependent in later years. Brookey, who had once been the child under her mother's authority, now appeared to manage much of the practical reality of their shared life. This reversal created tension that was not always visible but seemed to exist beneath daily interactions. Financial records later reviewed by investigators added another dimension to this complexity. Social Security payments intended for Christine were found to have been accessed and managed in ways that raised questions about control and consent. Whether this was a matter of convenience, coercion, or exploitation would become a central issue in the investigation that followed. But at the time, there were no immediate answers, only patterns that suggested something was not aligned. Around this same period, Christine's presence in the lives of others began to diminish without explanation. Friends and acquaintances noticed her absence gradually rather than suddenly. Calls went unanswered. Visits were no longer possible. When questions were raised, responses from Brookey were vague or indirect, often suggesting that Christine had relocated or was staying elsewhere. Over time, these explanations became less convincing, particularly to those who had known Christine for years and understood her tendencies to maintain contact even during periods of instability. Still, without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, there was little that could be done. Life continued, and Christine's absence became a quiet mystery rather than an urgent concern. It would take several years before that absence would be understood in a far more permanent and disturbing context. When investigators later reconstructed this timeline, they would identify a critical window in the late 1990s when Christine effectively disappeared from public view. No verified sightings, no consistent communication, no financial or personal activity that could be independently confirmed. In retrospect, this absence would become one of the most significant indicators in the case, but at the time it passed without formal investigation. The relationship between Brookey and Christine, when viewed through the lens of later events, began to resemble something less like a traditional family structure and more like a closed system, one in which external visibility gradually diminished until only internal narratives remained. What those narratives were, and how they were maintained, would become the central question investigators would later struggle to answer. Christine Smith's life, when viewed in isolation, already carried the weight of a story shaped more by survival than stability, but it is only when placed against the backdrop of her daughter Brookey West's trajectory that the full emotional complexity of the case begins to emerge. Christine was not simply a victim or a perpetrator in her own right. She was a woman whose identity had been repeatedly reshaped by loss, violence, and fractured attachments, each chapter leaving behind traces that would later echo through the lives of those closest to her. Those who knew her described her in conflicting terms, sometimes as warm and personable, someone who could engage easily in conversation and form quick connections, and at other times as volatile, unpredictable, and emotionally reactive in ways that made long-term stability difficult. There was no single version of Christine that fully captured her existence, only fragments that shifted depending on circumstance and memory. Her early adulthood had been marked by a rapid transition into marriage with Leroy Smith, a man whose presence initially suggested structure and authority. He had served in the military and later worked in law enforcement, and for Christine, this association may have represented a form of protection from the instability she had known in her youth. Together they built a family and had 2 children, Brookey and Travis, and for a brief period their household carried the appearance of conventional domestic life. But beneath that surface, instability was already taking root in ways that would later define the family's trajectory. Leroy Smith, according to later accounts, was not a stabilizing force in the way his profession implied. His personal beliefs and behaviors diverged significantly from the expectations associated with his role in law enforcement. Reports of extremist ideology and fascination with occult practices emerged later through secondary accounts, painting a picture of a household environment where ideological tension and psychological unpredictability were present. For Christine, this environment gradually became unsustainable, and the breakdown of the marriage resulted in Leroy leaving the family. The separation itself was not clean or emotionally contained. It involved the fragmentation of the household and, more significantly, the separation of Christine from her children. Brookey and her brother were taken away from her care, placed into state supervision, and for Christine, this loss became a defining rupture that would shape her subsequent decisions. What followed was not a straightforward attempt at rebuilding, but a series of emotional and behavioral reactions that reflected both grief and instability. Christine entered into new relationships, including one with a man named David, which would ultimately result in a violent confrontation. That relationship, according to later testimony, began with intensity and emotional dependence, but deteriorated into conflict when expectations were not met. The situation escalated to the point where Christine, feeling betrayed and emotionally overwhelmed, confronted David in a public setting and shot him at close range with a shotgun. This act led to her arrest and conviction for attempted murder, a moment that would permanently alter her legal and psychological identity. During her incarceration, Christine was exposed to a structured environment that contrasted sharply with the volatility of her previous life, but the period of confinement was relatively brief compared to the severity of the offense. She served approximately 2 years before being released on parole, a decision that would later be scrutinized in hindsight given the trajectory of events that followed. Upon release, Christine attempted to re-establish contact with her children, but the passage of time had already created emotional distance that could not be easily reversed. Brookey and Travis had spent their formative years in state care, and their understanding of their mother had been shaped more by absence than presence. When Christine re-entered their lives, it was not as a continuous figure of authority or care, but as someone returning from a gap that had already altered family identity. Despite these challenges, the family eventually reunited under complex circumstances. Leroy Smith reappeared briefly in their lives, and the children were returned to parental custody before the family relocated to California. This relocation marked another attempt at rebuilding, but it did not resolve the underlying instability that had characterized earlier years. Brookey, entering adolescence during this period, began to develop a distinct identity that contrasted sharply with her mother's unpredictability. While Christine remained emotionally reactive and dependent on relational stability that often shifted without warning, Brookey gravitated toward structure, logic, and systems. She demonstrated an early aptitude for technical thinking, particularly in areas requiring precision and analytical reasoning. These traits would later become central to her career in technical writing, a profession that demands clarity, consistency, and the ability to translate complex systems into understandable documentation. As Brookey transitioned into adulthood, she pursued education and eventually military service, an environment that further reinforced discipline and structured thinking. Her time in the military exposed her to technological systems and organizational frameworks that aligned with her cognitive strengths, and after her service, she transitioned into civilian technical work. Over time, she established herself professionally, securing employment in technical writing and building a life that, from the outside, appeared stable and self-directed. She purchased a home in California, maintained steady employment, and developed routines that reflected independence. Yet despite this external stability, her connection to Christine remained an unresolved emotional thread that continued to influence her life in subtle but persistent ways. Christine, meanwhile, experienced a different trajectory. As she aged, her dependence on others increased, particularly on Brookey, who by then had become the more financially and logistically stable figure in their relationship. Christine's relocation to Las Vegas, facilitated by Brookey, was framed as a practical decision driven by cost of living considerations and lifestyle preferences. Las Vegas offered affordability and access to amenities that Christine valued, particularly its social and entertainment environment. But beneath this practical explanation lay a deeper dependency dynamic that would become increasingly significant over time. Once they began living together in Las Vegas, their relationship entered a new phase defined by proximity and constant interaction. Those who observed them during this period described a household that functioned with a strange blend of cooperation and tension. Daily routines existed, meals were shared, and conversations occurred, but there was an undercurrent of emotional complexity that was difficult to interpret from the outside. At times, the relationship appeared functional, even supportive. At other times, it seemed marked by subtle control, unspoken resentment, and shifting boundaries that were not clearly defined. Christine, who had once been the primary caregiver in Brookey's childhood, now appeared increasingly reliant on her daughter for both emotional and practical support. Brookey, who had once been the dependent child, now occupied the role of provider and decision-maker in many aspects of their shared life. This reversal of roles created a psychological imbalance that would later be examined closely by investigators. Financial dependency became one of the key areas of focus. Records indicated that Christine's Social Security benefits were being managed in ways that raised questions about access and authorization. While the exact nature of this arrangement was initially unclear, it suggested that Brookey had assumed a significant degree of control over financial resources that were legally designated for her mother. Whether this was done out of necessity, convenience, or something more concerning would become a central issue in the unfolding investigation. Outside the home, Christine's presence in social circles gradually diminished. Friends and acquaintances who had once maintained contact began to notice her absence, first sporadically and then consistently. Attempts to reach her were met with vague explanations or redirected communication through Brookey. Over time, Christine became increasingly invisible within her own social network, her existence confined almost entirely to the shared household with her daughter. This gradual withdrawal from external visibility is something investigators would later identify as significant, but at the time it did not trigger formal concern. In retrospect, this period represents a critical transition point in Christine's life, where her independence was no longer externally observable and her identity became increasingly intertwined with a single domestic environment. Within that environment, the relationship between mother and daughter evolved into something that resisted simple categorization. It was not purely affectionate, nor purely adversarial, but a shifting dynamic shaped by history, dependency, and unresolved emotional tension. As the years progressed, the boundaries between care and control became increasingly difficult to distinguish, setting the stage for the events that would later bring investigators to their doorstep. By the time Christine Smith's presence in Las Vegas had faded into quiet absence, there was no dramatic moment that marked her disappearance from the lives of those who once knew her. It did not happen in a single night or a sudden break that anyone could point to later and say this was when everything changed. Instead, it unfolded gradually, like a light dimming in a room that no one notices until it has already gone dark. Calls that once came regularly became less frequent, Visits stopped being arranged, and conversations that used to carry the texture of everyday life were replaced with vague updates delivered secondhand through Brookey West. For Christine's friends, the explanation they were given was simple on the surface, but increasingly difficult to accept with time. They were told she had moved, that she was staying with family, that she was no longer in the area. But when asked for specifics, the answers never expanded beyond that. There were no forwarding addresses, no consistent phone numbers, no direct contact that could confirm her well-being. And yet, in the absence of anything concrete, life around her continued. People assumed she had chosen distance, or that her circumstances had changed in ways that made communication difficult. What no one realized at the time was that Christine had not simply become unreachable, she had become invisible. Within the shared household she occupied with her daughter, the boundaries of her existence had narrowed to a single physical space, and even that space was increasingly controlled by conditions that outsiders could not see. Brookey West, who by this point had established herself as the primary logistical anchor in their relationship, managed much of the practical reality of their lives together. She handled finances, maintained routines, and structured the environment in which Christine lived. To observers, this might have appeared as responsibility or caregiving, but the nature of that arrangement was never clearly defined, and over time it began to raise quiet questions among those who had known Christine longer. Those questions did not initially reach the level of concern required for intervention, but they lingered in the background, unresolved and unverified. Inside the home, the relationship between mother and daughter operated on a rhythm that was difficult to interpret from the outside. There were moments of apparent normalcy, shared meals, routine conversations, the kind of interactions that suggested familiarity and coexistence. But there were also boundaries that seemed increasingly rigid, particularly around Christine's contact with others. Visitors were discouraged or outright restricted, and communication with people outside the household became filtered through Brookey's awareness. Over time, Christine's external connections diminished until they were almost entirely absent, leaving her existence anchored within a closed environment that few people could access or observe directly. Financially, the structure of their lives also reflected this shift. Christine's Social Security benefits, which should have provided her with independent financial autonomy, were instead managed in a way that suggested consolidation under Brookey's control. Transactions and account activity later reviewed by investigators would indicate that funds intended for Christine were being redirected or accessed without clear documentation of her involvement. At the time, however, these patterns were not yet visible to authorities. To the outside world, there was no active report of wrongdoing, no missing persons filing, no formal indication that anything was wrong. Christine had simply become someone who no longer appeared in the places she once occupied. What makes this period particularly significant in hindsight is not a single event, but the absence of events that should have drawn attention. There were no confirmed medical emergencies reported, no institutional records indicating relocation, no legal filings suggesting guardianship or incapacity. Instead, there was only silence, a prolonged and unexplained absence that gradually replaced her presence in every external system that might have tracked her existence. Within that silence, life continued for Brookey West in a way that, from an external perspective, appeared largely stable. She maintained employment, managed responsibilities, and continued building a life that outwardly reflected independence and control. Those who interacted with her professionally described her as competent, organized, and capable of handling complex tasks with precision. There was nothing in her professional demeanor that immediately suggested instability or concealment. And yet, the private reality of her life was increasingly disconnected from the public version of it. The household she shared with Christine existed outside of external visibility, and within that space, the usual mechanisms of accountability were absent. As months turned into years, Christine's disappearance from public awareness solidified into something more permanent. Friends who attempted to reconnect eventually stopped trying, assuming that circumstances had simply made contact impossible. In some cases, they accepted the explanation that she had moved in with family elsewhere, a narrative that required no further verification because it provided closure where none was otherwise available. This acceptance, built on uncertainty, allowed the absence to remain unchallenged. No formal investigation was initiated during this time, in part because there was no triggering event that demanded it. Christine was not reported missing, no welfare checks were requested, and no institution flagged her as unaccounted for. In the absence of a defined crisis, her disappearance remained invisible to systems designed to respond only when thresholds are crossed. What later made this period so critical to investigators was the realization that the conditions for concealment were not created in a moment of panic or reaction, but gradually, over time, through the steady reduction of visibility and contact. By the time law enforcement eventually became involved, Christine's absence had already been normalized within the limited circle of people who had known her. She had become someone who was spoken about in past tense, without anyone being able to identify the exact moment that transition occurred. It is this ambiguity that would later complicate every aspect of the investigation. Without a clear point of disappearance, there was no immediate timeline to reconstruct. Without witnesses to a definitive last sighting, there was no starting point for search efforts. And without earlier reports of concern, there was no paper trail to follow. Instead, investigators would be forced to work backward from the moment her remains were discovered, attempting to reconstruct years of silence from fragments of evidence that no one had recognized as significant at the time. In that sense, the events leading up to Christine Smith's eventual discovery in a Las Vegas storage unit were not defined by a singular act of violence that could be easily traced, but by a prolonged erosion of visibility, accountability, and connection. The disappearance did not announce itself. It settled in quietly, embedded within everyday routines and unspoken assumptions. And by the time anyone thought to question it, the absence had already taken root in ways that would make the truth far more difficult to uncover. The first thing that changed everything for investigators was not a confession, not a witness stepping forward, and not a sudden breakthrough in interrogation. It was a smell, a single, overwhelming sensory detail that refused to be ignored and that carried with it the unmistakable language of death. When officers entered the storage facility on that February afternoon, they were not expecting anything beyond a routine welfare check. Storage units, in their experience, usually contained forgotten furniture, old clothing, or boxes of personal history sealed away and left to time. But this was different from the moment they stepped into the corridor. The odor did not belong to neglect or mildew or rot in the ordinary sense. It was something deeper, heavier, and more final. It clung to the air in a way that made conversation unnecessary. Each officer knew instinctively that they were no longer dealing with property, but with a human life that had ended under circumstances that had not yet been revealed. When the unit door was finally opened, the interior seemed almost unremarkable at first glance. There was nothing visually dramatic, no immediate sign of struggle or disorder, just the quiet stillness of stored belongings. But that illusion collapsed quickly once attention shifted to the center of the space, where a large plastic garbage can sat sealed and isolated from everything around it. The can was not simply closed. It had been deliberately wrapped, layer after layer, in plastic film and duct tape, forming a tight seal that immediately suggested intention rather than disposal. It was not the act of throwing something away. It was the act of containing it. That distinction became clear to everyone present before the container was even opened. Every detail of its presentation spoke to time, effort, and a desire for concealment that went beyond panic or impulse. When investigators began documenting the scene, their observations were careful and methodical, but beneath that professionalism there was an unspoken recognition that they were dealing with something abnormal. A preliminary test confirmed the presence of biological material consistent with decomposition, and from that moment the investigation shifted into a homicide response. A warrant was quickly obtained, and when the container was finally opened under controlled conditions, the reality inside forced even experienced personnel into a moment of silence. What had been concealed was not simply a body in the abstract sense, but a human remains that had undergone extensive decomposition within a sealed environment. The process of time and confinement had transformed the contents into something unrecognizable at first glance, requiring forensic analysis rather than visual identification. The condition of the remains immediately complicated any attempt to determine cause of death. There were no obvious signs of trauma visible in the initial examination, no clear indication of gunshot wounds or sharp force injuries that could immediately explain what had occurred. Instead, what investigators were confronted with was ambiguity, a set of circumstances that suggested violence had taken place but did not immediately reveal its form. One detail, however, stood out with unsettling clarity. A bag had been placed over the victim's head and secured tightly, a deliberate act that indicated intentional concealment of identity and possibly method. This was not incidental. It was controlled, purposeful, and executed with care that suggested awareness of forensic consequences. Inside the storage unit itself, additional items began to form a broader picture that investigators could not yet fully interpret, but could not ignore either. Personal belongings were present, but interspersed among them were objects that seemed disconnected from ordinary domestic life. Books referencing occult practices, materials associated with ritual symbolism, and other unusual items created an atmosphere that felt disjointed from the expected contents of a storage space. While investigators were cautious not to assign meaning prematurely, the combination of these objects with the sealed container created a psychological weight at the scene that was difficult to dismiss. The initial focus, however, remained on identification. Inside the unit, investigators located a wallet containing a driver's license belonging to Christine M. Smith. That single document provided the first concrete link between the remains and a real identity. From there, the investigation expanded outward rapidly. Records showed that the storage unit had been rented under the name Brookey West, Christine's daughter. That connection immediately reframed the case from an unidentified death to a familial investigation, one where the closest relative of the victim was directly tied to the location where the body had been found. At that stage, investigators did not yet assume guilt or intent, but the significance of the relationship was unavoidable. When Christine's last known address was checked, it was discovered that the residence was also associated with Brookey West. This overlapping of addresses and control of spaces began to suggest a pattern that required deeper examination. A search warrant was executed at the apartment, and what investigators found inside added further complexity rather than clarity. The space appeared lived in, though sparsely furnished, and there were indications that only one person had been actively occupying it. Among the items recovered were materials that would later become central to the investigation, including duct tape and a key that appeared to correspond to the storage unit. When forensic analysis was conducted, the duct tape recovered from the apartment was matched to the tape used to seal the garbage can, establishing a physical link between the residence and the crime scene. This was no longer circumstantial. It was material continuity between two locations connected to the same individual. Financial records recovered during the search introduced another dimension. Investigators discovered that Social Security payments intended for Christine Smith had been collected over an extended period, despite her apparent absence from public life. This raised immediate questions about access, control, and the possibility that Christine's disappearance had not been reported because it benefited someone financially. At the same time, investigators began speaking with neighbors and individuals who had interacted with Christine and Brookey over the years. The accounts they received were inconsistent, but revealing in their patterns. Some described a relationship that appeared close and cooperative at times, with shared routines and moments of apparent familiarity. Others described tension, emotional distance, and shifting dynamics that suggested underlying instability. What emerged was not a single narrative, but a relationship that seemed to oscillate between connection and conflict without ever stabilizing into something clearly defined. More troubling was the recurring observation that Christine's presence had gradually diminished over time without explanation. People who had once seen her regularly began noticing her absence, and when they asked about her, responses were vague or deflective. Brookey often provided explanations that suggested relocation or temporary absence, but these accounts were not verifiable. Over time, Christine simply stopped appearing in any observable context. For investigators, this pattern of gradual disappearance was significant because it suggested that whatever had happened did not occur in a single moment of crisis that would have triggered external intervention. Instead, It appeared to have unfolded over an extended period in which visibility was steadily reduced until there was nothing left to observe. At this stage of the investigation, Brookey West had not yet been located for formal questioning, but she had already become the central figure in the case. Every piece of evidence, from financial records to physical materials, pointed toward her involvement in some capacity, whether direct or indirect. Yet despite these indicators, the absence of witnesses to a specific event, combined with the advanced condition of the remains, meant that the case still lacked a clear narrative of how Christine Smith had died. Investigators were left with a body, a storage unit filled with fragmented evidence, and a daughter whose presence connected every thread but whose actions had not yet been fully reconstructed. What they had was not yet a case that could be fully explained, but a set of circumstances that demanded deeper inquiry into what had occurred behind closed doors long before the storage unit was ever opened. By the time Carrie Rogers started digging deeper into her husband's life, what she thought she was uncovering felt like fragments of a personal betrayal. At first, it was just the uneasy feeling that something didn't fit. The late nights at work that didn't quite line up with hospital schedules. The phone that always seemed to flip face down when she walked into the room. The explanations that arrived too quickly, too rehearsed, like lines practiced in advance rather than truth spoken in the moment. But in a case like this, the line between suspicion and obsession can blur fast, especially when every new detail seems to confirm what you don't want to believe. Carrie's investigation didn't begin with police or detectives. It began in the quiet hours after the children were asleep, when the house finally stopped moving and the only sound left was the hum of appliances and her own thoughts refusing to settle. She started with what was closest, Lonnie's phone habits. At first it seemed harmless, even ordinary in a modern marriage. But then came the patterns, messages that appeared late at night and vanished quickly. Contacts saved under first names only, or initials that didn't mean anything at first glance. And then there was the consistency of one number that kept reappearing like a thread she couldn't pull without unraveling something larger. When she finally dialed it, she wasn't prepared for how quickly things escalated. The conversation didn't bring clarity. It brought heat. Raised voices, defensive answers, and a tone from Lonnie she didn't recognize. Not anger exactly, but something sharper, controlled irritation, as if she had interrupted a system that depended on secrecy. When he finally admitted that the number belonged to a coworker, Carrie tried to accept it, but her instincts had already shifted. Once suspicion takes root, it doesn't simply disappear because someone says the right words. It grows in the gaps between explanations. The next phase of her search wasn't emotional anymore. It was methodical. Carrie began tracing patterns instead of feelings. She noted timestamps of texts, the gaps in his work schedule, the nights he claimed to be exhausted yet seemed unreachable. She started writing things down, not as accusations, but as anchors against confusion. Because something about Lonnie's responses made her feel like reality itself was becoming negotiable. The confrontation with the woman she believed was involved came next. It wasn't a dramatic discovery in the cinematic sense. It was more disjointed, messy, and uncertain. A drive to an unfamiliar address. A knock on a door that felt too loud in the silence of a suburban street. A woman opening it with confusion already forming on her face before Carrie even spoke. Words were exchanged quickly, defensively. Denials that came too fast to be comfortable, but not specific enough to confirm anything either. Carrie left without answers, only more friction added to the growing tension inside her own home. But the real shift in the investigation didn't come from confrontation. It came from discovery. It happened in the garage. The space had always been practical, cluttered in the way family homes often are. Tools, boxes, storage bins stacked in uneven columns. Nothing about it suggested anything unusual at first glance. But Carrie wasn't looking at it with ordinary eyes anymore. She was looking for patterns, for inconsistencies, for anything that felt out of place in a life that was supposedly stable. What she found didn't look like evidence at first. It looked like fragments of unrelated objects, zip ties bundled loosely in a container, nylon stockings folded and tucked away without explanation, a syringe with traces of liquid left behind as if forgotten in haste. None of it made immediate sense on its own, but together, the combination created a feeling she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just unusual. It felt staged in its concealment, like items meant to be hidden rather than discarded. When she confronted Lonnie about it, his response came quickly. Too quickly. The kind of explanation that tries to collapse complexity into simplicity before questions can multiply. The zip ties were for household organization. The syringe belonged to medical work, left behind accidentally. The stockings, he claimed, were either hers or part of some misunderstanding. Each answer attempted to isolate the objects, to strip them of connection. But Carrie couldn't separate them anymore. In her mind, they had already formed a pattern she couldn't unsee. Still, she didn't have proof. And without proof, suspicion remains fragile. It can bend back on the person holding it. So she waited. For a time, the marriage entered a strange limbo. Arguments were followed by reconciliation. Suspicion was followed by counseling. Lonnie, sensing the pressure, seemed to adapt. He became more attentive in some moments, more distant in others. He offered reassurance with the same timing that made it difficult to know whether it was genuine or strategic. And Carrie, exhausted by the emotional instability and the responsibility of raising 4 children, began to question her own perception. That doubt is often where dangerous uncertainty thrives. But then came the phone tracker. It was a small feature, almost insignificant in design. Something intended for convenience, not revelation. But when Carrie activated it one night after Lonnie failed to return home when expected, it became something else entirely. A window into a version of reality she had not been given access to. The signal placed him somewhere unexpected. Not at work. Not on a known route between hospitals or home. Instead, it showed him in downtown Chico, stationary at first, then moving in ways that didn't align with his explanation. When she called him, his voice was calm, almost annoyed at the interruption. He insisted he was at work. He insisted the system must be wrong. But the data on her screen told a different story. For the first time, Carrie wasn't just doubting him emotionally. She was seeing contradiction in real time. The confrontation that followed didn't resolve anything. It escalated instead. Lonnie called back later from a hospital line, attempting to re-anchor his story. But by then, Carrie no longer trusted the explanation, even when it came dressed in professional certainty. The more he insisted, the more she felt reality shifting underneath her. Sleep became difficult after that. Not because of fear, but because of anticipation. The sense that something unresolved was moving closer to the surface. She began waking early, checking messages before the house stirred, watching for inconsistencies in timing, tone, location. It wasn't paranoia yet. It was accumulation. Then came the morning of January 27, 2013. The moment that changed everything wasn't loud at first. It began with silence. The absence of expected routine. The unanswered messages. The growing awareness that something in the air outside the house felt different, as if the neighborhood itself had paused. When Carrie stepped outside, she noticed the presence immediately. Police vehicles. Officers moving with controlled urgency rather than chaos. The kind of movement that signals preparation rather than reaction. Her first thought wasn't crime. It was accident. A crash, a medical emergency, something explainable. But explanation didn't come. Instead, she was guided back inside. The conversation with investigators unfolded slowly, carefully, as if each sentence needed to be measured before being released. Carrie learned that Lonnie had been stopped the night before in connection with an ongoing investigation involving assaults near a university campus. At first, the details were fragmented. Surveillance activity, suspicious driving patterns, a stop sign violation that led to a traffic stop. But as they continued, the picture became sharper and far more disturbing. Inside Lonnie's vehicle, police had found items that did not belong in a routine commute. Blankets in the back seat, described by victims in earlier incidents as part of an enclosed space used during attacks. Syringes containing clear substances. Items of clothing, including stockings that matched descriptions from victims who reported a masked attacker. Tape. Medical supplies. Objects that, when viewed individually, might be explainable in isolation, but together formed a structure of intent that could not easily be dismissed. Carrie listened, but part of her mind resisted the connection. This was still Lonnie, the father of her children, the man who had worked long hospital shifts, who had once built a life with her from shared beginnings. And yet every detail being described by investigators seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The most devastating part was not the evidence itself, but the pattern it suggested. This was not random. It was organized, repeated, intentional. As the investigation expanded, more details emerged. Search warrants executed. Additional items recovered from vehicles and personal spaces. Zip ties consistent with those found earlier in Carrie's garage memory. Medical substances capable of incapacitation. Evidence suggesting preparation rather than impulse. And then came the charges. Rape.
Kidnapping.
Assault with intent to commit sexual violence. Carrie's world did not collapse in a single moment. It fractured in stages. Each new detail removed another layer of the person she thought she knew, until what remained was something she could not recognize but was still legally, emotionally, and structurally tied to her life. What made the situation even more destabilizing was the overlap between two realities. In one, Lonnie was a husband and father struggling under pressure, overwork, and personal strain. In the other, he was being described by investigators as someone operating with deliberate intent, using concealment, planning, and repeated patterns of behavior that suggested escalation over time. Those two versions could not comfortably exist together, and yet both were being presented as real. As news of the arrest spread beyond the immediate investigation, Carrie also learned that the co-worker she had once confronted was not a fantasy or misunderstanding. The affair had been real, confirmed independently. That revelation did not simplify things. It complicated them further, because it meant that even within the version of Lonnie that seemed grounded in emotional explanation, deception had still been present. For investigators, the case was no longer just about a single incident or accusation. It had become a structure of overlapping behaviors, alleged assaults, suspicious materials, inconsistent alibis, and a growing list of victims whose descriptions matched the evidence found during searches. Each new discovery reinforced the others, building a case that no longer depended on a single thread of proof, but on convergence. For Carrie, however, the investigation was not abstract. It was personal disintegration in real time. By the end of that phase, there was no longer any meaningful question about whether Lonnie would face charges. The evidence had moved beyond speculation into formal accusation. What remained uncertain was not guilt in the investigative sense, but understanding in the human sense. How someone could live a double life so completely embedded within ordinary family structures without detection. And for Carrie, that question had no immediate answer. Only silence remained where certainty used to be. The breakthrough in the case of Lonnie Keith did not arrive like a dramatic revelation in a single flash of clarity. It came instead, as most true crime turning points do, unevenly, through fragments of evidence slowly aligning into something that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. For investigators in Chico and surrounding jurisdictions, the early days after Lonnie's arrest were defined by urgency, but also by caution. They knew what they had was serious, but they also knew that building a case of this magnitude required more than disturbing objects and circumstantial suspicion. It required a narrative that could survive scrutiny in court. At first, the investigation focused tightly on the physical evidence recovered from Lonnie's vehicle. Each item was cataloged, photographed, and analyzed in isolation before being placed back into the larger puzzle. The syringes were tested for substances capable of incapacitating a person. The results confirmed the presence of a chemical combination consistent with sedatives often associated with hospital environments. That detail alone shifted the tone of the case. It suggested not only access, but knowledge and understanding of dosage, effect, and timing that went beyond casual familiarity. Then there were the fibers and materials found in the back seat. The blankets were not ordinary household items thrown carelessly into a car. Forensic analysis showed traces of repeated use in enclosed environments, with embedded fibers matching clothing types described by multiple victims in prior assaults. The stockings, too, became important. not just as isolated objects, but as part of a pattern of concealment. Victim statements from earlier incidents had repeatedly mentioned an attacker whose face was obscured, often described through thin, stretched fabric that distorted his features while still allowing movement and control. Each new piece of evidence did not stand alone. It reinforced what was already forming, a behavioral signature. But the most significant early breakthrough did not come from the physical evidence. It came from data. Digital records from Lonnie's phone and GPS system began to reveal patterns that investigators could not ignore. Over months, his movements showed repeated deviations from his claimed work locations. At first, these discrepancies could have been explained as errors, delays, or personal errands. But as analysts mapped the data over time, a pattern emerged that was too structured to be accidental. There were repeated nighttime routes converging near the same areas where prior assaults had been reported. There were periods where his phone activity went dark entirely, followed by reappearances in locations inconsistent with his stated schedule. Most importantly, there were clusters of movement that aligned with victim reports of timing and geography. Alone, each instance was ambiguous. Together, they began to form a map of behavior that investigators could visualize with increasing clarity. Still, even with this data, prosecutors were careful. They knew that juries do not convict on patterns alone. They convict on connection. The question remained, could Lonnie be definitively tied to the crimes in a way that left no room for reasonable doubt? That answer began to form when investigators re-examined victim testimony with renewed focus. Initially, the assaults connected to Lonnie had been treated as separate incidents. Different victims, different dates, different circumstances. But when detectives began comparing statements side by side, subtle similarities emerged. Descriptions of restraint methods, the sensation of being restrained with materials that felt improvised but deliberate, the use of substances that caused disorientation without immediate loss of consciousness, the presence of a confined space that smelled faintly sterile, as if cleaned or controlled rather than chaotic. Most compelling was the repeated reference to an attacker who maintained a disturbing level of calm. Not frantic or impulsive, but methodical. Someone who spoke minimally, if at all, and acted with a kind of procedural detachment that made the experiences feel less like spontaneous violence and more like execution of a process. That detail changed the psychological framing of the case. Investigators began to consider whether they were not dealing with isolated acts of violence, but with a repeated behavioral system. Something rehearsed, something refined over time. While this analysis was unfolding, Carrie was experiencing her own parallel breakthrough, though it was not one she welcomed. For her, the pieces of Lonnie's double life were no longer theoretical. They were collapsing into a single unbearable structure. She began reviewing old memories with new suspicion. Conversations that once seemed ordinary now felt layered with possible omission. Moments of absence that had been brushed aside as routines suddenly felt significant. Even photographs of family life took on a different tone, as if she were looking at evidence rather than memories. But the most devastating realization for Carrie came not from new evidence, but from confirmation of something she had already feared. The coworker she had confronted months earlier was no longer a question mark. Investigators confirmed that the relationship had existed, not just emotionally, but physically. It had continued for a significant period of time, overlapping with the same timeline Carrie had been trying to stabilize her marriage. That confirmation did not bring relief or closure. It simply removed one of the last remaining spaces where doubt had still been possible. What remained was a picture of deception that extended across both personal and criminal dimensions. Meanwhile, in the formal investigation, a key forensic breakthrough occurred when analysts returned to the duct tape recovered from Lonnie's vehicle and related items. Earlier tests had already established that the tape matched materials used in the storage of evidence and items associated with the investigation. But a second, more detailed examination revealed something investigators had not expected: a latent fingerprint preserved on the inner surface of plastic wrapping found at one of the key storage sites. The print, partially degraded but still usable, was submitted for comparison. When the results came back, they confirmed a match. The fingerprint belonged to Lonnie Keith. It was not a dramatic revelation in the moment it was received. There was no immediate celebration or declaration. Instead, there was silence in the room where analysts reviewed the report. Because what the fingerprint represented was not just presence. It was contact. Direct interaction with the materials used in concealment. That single piece of evidence shifted the case from circumstantial accumulation to direct physical connection. From that point forward, investigators began reconstructing the timeline with renewed precision. They identified overlapping windows of opportunity between Lonnie's known movements and the timing of assaults. They re-examined hospital records, work schedules, and vehicle tracking data. Each layer of verification reinforced the others, reducing the number of plausible explanations that could be offered in defense. But even with mounting evidence, one question remained central to the prosecution strategy: intent. Proving that Lonnie had been present, or even that he had engaged in inappropriate behavior, was not enough. Prosecutors needed to demonstrate planning. They needed to show that the actions were not impulsive, but deliberate. This required connecting the tools, the timing, and the repeated patterns into a single narrative of purpose. To do this, investigators brought in behavioral analysts. Their role was not to speculate on morality, but to interpret structure. What they saw in the evidence was not randomness. It was repetition with variation, a hallmark of escalation. Each incident appeared to refine certain elements while maintaining core components: restraint, sedation, concealment, and control. The analysts noted that in many serial behavioral cases, offenders develop what is essentially a personal method, a set of procedures that becomes more efficient over time. In Lonnie's case, they observed what appeared to be increasing sophistication in concealment materials and victim selection zones. This suggested not only repetition but learning. It was this interpretation that gave prosecutors the confidence to move forward with a consolidated case theory. They were no longer presenting isolated incidents. They were presenting a pattern of behavior that, when viewed in totality, pointed toward a single perpetrator operating over time. As the case approached the final stages before trial, Lonnie's legal defense attempted to fracture that narrative. They argued inconsistencies in timelines, alternative explanations for possession of certain items, and the possibility that evidence had been misinterpreted. They also attempted to isolate the personal life of Lonnie from the criminal allegations, suggesting that marital dysfunction and emotional strain could explain some of the suspicious behaviors. But what they could not easily dismantle was convergence. Too many independent elements were pointing in the same direction: the digital data, the physical evidence, the victim testimonies, the forensic connections. Each one alone might have been challenged. Together, they formed a structure that was increasingly difficult to destabilize. For Carrie, this stage of the investigation was less about discovery and more about endurance. She was no longer searching for answers in the hope of restoring her understanding of her husband. She was watching a legal system assemble those answers without her, and realizing that her role in the story had shifted from participant to witness. The man she had built a life with was being reconstructed through evidence. Not memory, not emotion, evidence. And as that reconstruction solidified, the breakthrough investigators had been working toward was no longer a question of possibility. It was a matter of presentation. The case was ready to move forward. The courtroom in Chico was not unusually large, but on the morning of Lonnie Keith's trial it felt compressed, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of everything that had happened outside it. The air carried a quiet tension that is difficult to describe unless you have stood in a room where every seat is occupied not just by people, but by expectation. Families of victims sat on one side, their posture rigid, with a kind of restrained exhaustion that comes from years of waiting. On the other side were legal teams, journalists, observers, and Lonnie himself, seated in a suit that looked too neutral for the gravity of what it represented. Carrie sat further back than anyone expected her to. She was not part of the prosecution team, not a witness in the formal sense of the word for this phase of proceedings, but her presence still altered the atmosphere in subtle ways. She did not look like someone attending a public trial. She looked like someone revisiting a life she no longer recognized, forced to walk through it step by step in front of strangers. When the judge entered, The room settled into silence, so complete that even the sound of paper shifting seemed too loud. The prosecution began not with emotion, but with structure. They laid out the framework of the case carefully, almost clinically at first, because they understood that jurors needed to be guided through complexity rather than overwhelmed by it. They described Lonnie Keith as a man who lived two parallel existences. In one, he was a physician assistant, a husband, a father, someone embedded in the rhythms of ordinary life. In the other, they alleged, he was someone who constructed environments of control and concealment, using access, knowledge, and opportunity to facilitate repeated acts of violence. The prosecution did not rush this narrative. They allowed it to unfold slowly, like a map being drawn in front of the jury in real time. When they presented the physical evidence, the courtroom shifted subtly. The images of the vehicle interior, the items recovered, the materials cataloged from searches, all appeared on screens that forced everyone present to confront them without distance. The syringes, the restraints, the tape, the clothing items. Each object was introduced with context, not speculation. Each one tied to either victim accounts or forensic results. The prosecution strategy was not to overwhelm with shock, but to connect with consistency. They emphasized repetition. They emphasized pattern recognition. They returned again and again to the idea that no single item was accidental in isolation, but intentional when viewed collectively. When they introduced digital evidence, the tone of the courtroom shifted again. Maps showing movement patterns. GPS logs reconstructed into timelines. Visualizations that placed Lonnie in proximity to known crime locations at critical times. Jurors leaned forward slightly not because the evidence was theatrical, but because it demanded cognitive alignment. The question was no longer whether something unusual had occurred. It was how many times it had occurred and under what circumstances. The fingerprint evidence became one of the most significant moments of the prosecution's presentation. When the forensic expert testified, the room became still in a way that felt almost unnatural. There was no dramatic phrasing, no embellishment, just a description of where the print was found, how it was preserved, and how it matched Lonnie's identity. But the simplicity of the explanation made it more powerful. It was direct contact between accused and concealment environment, reduced to a scientific conclusion that could not easily be reframed. The defense responded with equal caution, understanding that this was not a case that could be won through emotional appeal alone. Their approach focused on fragmentation. They attempted to isolate each piece of evidence from the broader narrative, arguing that proximity did not equal participation, that possession did not equal intent, and that correlation did not automatically establish causation. They emphasized Lonnie's professional background, suggesting that access to medical supplies was not unusual. They raised the possibility of contamination or misinterpretation of forensic materials. They challenged the reliability of victim memory under trauma conditions. They attempted to reintroduce ambiguity into what the prosecution had carefully structured as convergence. But the difficulty for the defense was not in individual arguments. It was in the cumulative weight of the case. Every time they pulled on one thread, another remained intact. Every explanation required additional assumptions that grew increasingly difficult to sustain simultaneously. When victim testimony was introduced, the tone of the courtroom changed again. Not because of graphic description, but because of human presence. Survivors spoke in controlled voices, often pausing longer than expected between sentences, not because they were unsure of what to say, but because of the emotional distance required to say it at all. They described confusion, loss of control, disorientation, and the persistent sense of being managed rather than attacked in chaos. That distinction became important. It suggested structure rather than randomness. Carrie did not testify in the main proceedings, but she was present during key segments of the trial. Watching Lonnie sit quietly as details of his alleged actions were described created a kind of emotional dissonance that she struggled to process. There were moments when she expected recognition, denial, anger, anything that would reassert the identity she had known. But what she saw instead was restraint, controlled silence, a lack of visible reaction that made interpretation more difficult, not less. As the trial progressed, the prosecution moved toward motive, which is often the most unstable element in cases built on behavioral patterns. They argued that Lonnie's actions were driven by a combination of access, opportunity, and psychological reinforcement over time. They did not attempt to oversimplify motivation into a single cause. Instead, they presented it as layered: professional knowledge enabling control, behavioral repetition reinforcing escalation, and personal compartmentalization allowing continuation of normal life alongside alleged acts. The defense countered by suggesting that the narrative being constructed was retrospective interpretation, that investigators, once they identified a suspect, had aligned unrelated events into a pattern that only appeared coherent after the fact. They warned the jury against the human tendency to find structure in randomness, especially in emotionally charged cases. But what undermined that argument was the consistency across independent categories of evidence. Physical, digital, testimonial, and forensic data were not dependent on a single interpretation. They reinforced each other across different domains of verification. One of the final and most impactful moments came during closing arguments. The prosecution did not raise their voice. They did not attempt to dramatize. Instead, they walked the jury back through the timeline, piece by piece, connecting each evidentiary point to the next until the structure of the case was visible in full. They asked the jury to consider not just what each piece of evidence suggested individually, but what it meant when viewed as a complete system. A system that included repeated presence near crime scenes, possession of specialized materials, forensic linkage to concealment, and behavioral consistency across multiple incidents. The defense's closing statement focused on caution. They reminded the jury that suspicion is not proof, that patterns can mislead, and that lives can be destroyed by interpretation without absolute certainty. They emphasized the irreversible nature of conviction. Then came the waiting. Deliberation in cases like this is never truly silent, even when the room itself is. It exists in the tension between competing interpretations, in the mental reassembly of evidence, in the repeated testing of doubt against conviction. Jurors are not simply deciding guilt or innocence. They are deciding whether the structure presented to them holds under pressure. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom did not erupt. It exhaled. Lonnie Keith was found guilty on multiple counts, including kidnapping and rape-related charges connected to the pattern of assaults presented during trial. The decision was not unanimous in feeling, but it was unanimous in legal conclusion. The evidence, as structured, had met the threshold required by law. Sentencing came later, but the emotional weight of the case had already reached its peak in that moment. Lonnie received a lengthy prison term that effectively removed him from society for decades. The judge's remarks focused not only on punishment, but on the sustained nature of the harm described throughout the proceedings. For Carrie, the verdict did not function as closure in the emotional sense. It functioned as finality in the structural sense. The legal system had reached its conclusion, but her personal understanding of what had happened to her life remained fractured. There is no courtroom mechanism that can reconstruct trust once it has been dismantled at that scale. After sentencing, as the courtroom began to empty, Carrie remained seated for a while longer than necessary. Not because she was waiting for anything, but because movement itself felt disconnected from meaning. Around her, conversations resumed, reporters gathered information, attorneys organized files, and life outside the case continued to move forward. But for her, the case did not end with a verdict. It ended with recognition that two versions of the same person had existed simultaneously, and that neither could be fully reconciled with the other. And in that silence after judgment, the final weight of the trial was not legal at all. It was personal. After the courtroom emptied and the machinery of the legal system moved on to the next case, what remained for Carrie Rogers was something far more difficult to define. There is a moment in every long criminal case when the public story ends but the private one continues, and that space is often the hardest to inhabit. For Carrie, the verdict against Lonnie Keith did not feel like an ending. It felt like a boundary had been drawn around a chapter of her life she could no longer enter, even if parts of her mind still tried to walk back into it. The house in Chico, once filled with the ordinary noise of family life, no longer felt ordinary. It was still structurally the same place, still carrying the same walls, rooms, and routines, but memory had altered its atmosphere. Every space contained an echo of reinterpretation. A hallway that once meant daily movement now carried the weight of unanswered questions. A kitchen that once held family meals now felt like a place where conversations had been filtered through unknowable truth. In the early months after the trial, Carrie experienced time differently. Mornings did not begin with clarity, but with repetition. The same thoughts returned before she could fully wake up, as if her mind was replaying the events of the past years in no particular order, searching for a version that made emotional sense. There was no single moment of collapse. Instead, there was a gradual realization that trust, once fractured at that scale, does not return in its original form. It either changes shape or disappears entirely. What made the aftermath particularly complex was that Carrie was not only processing betrayal, but also reconstruction. She had to rebuild an understanding of her own past while raising 4 children, who were also trying to understand what had happened to their family. For them, Lonnie was not only a defendant in a courtroom. He was a father whose absence now carried legal definition. That distinction mattered, but it did not simplify grief. In the months following sentencing, Carrie began to notice something unexpected about her own emotional responses. The anger did not arrive in a single wave. It came in fragments. Sometimes it appeared during quiet moments when she was folding laundry or organizing the house. Other times it surfaced when she encountered ordinary reminders of domestic life that no longer felt neutral. A medical phrase on television. A passing mention of a hospital shift. A familiar route through town that used to represent routine but now felt layered with memory. The psychological impact was not immediate shock anymore. It was long-term recalibration. She began therapy not because she needed answers about the case, but because she needed to understand how to exist within a life that had been redefined without her consent. In those sessions, she often described a sensation of living adjacent to her own memories, as if they belonged to someone she once was but could no longer fully access. One of the most difficult realizations was that closure, as commonly understood, is not a fixed destination. The legal outcome provided a framework of accountability, but it did not resolve the internal contradiction of having shared a life with someone who is simultaneously a husband and a concealed offender. Those two identities could not be merged into a single narrative without distortion. They had to remain separate, even though they coexisted in the same timeline. As time passed, Carrie began to shift her focus away from attempting to reconcile Lonnie's duality and toward rebuilding her own continuity. That process was not linear. There were periods of stability followed by sudden emotional disruption triggered by unexpected reminders. But gradually, she began to develop a different relationship with her past. Not one of resolution, but of containment. She returned to work in a limited capacity, carefully rebuilding professional identity in ways that did not require immediate emotional exposure. She restructured daily routines around her children's needs, using consistency as a stabilizing force. The home became less of a place of memory and more of a place of function again, though the transition took time. What emerged most clearly in this period was resilience, but not in the simplistic sense of strength after adversity. It was more accurate to describe it as adaptation under conditions of irreversible change. Carrie did not return to who she was before the investigation. She became someone who had integrated knowledge that could not be unlearned. The children, too, processed the aftermath in different ways depending on age and understanding. For them, the absence of Lonnie was not just emotional but structural.
Routines had changed.
Explanations had to be simplified without being distorted. Carrie learned that protecting them did not mean shielding them from truth entirely, but helping them understand it in forms they could carry without fragmentation. Outside the family, the case gradually transitioned from active legal proceedings into public memory. For investigators and journalists, it became another entry in a broader pattern of cases that reveal how concealed behavior can exist within ordinary environments for extended periods of time. For legal professionals, it became an example of how multi-layered evidence, when properly structured, can establish patterns that withstand courtroom scrutiny even in the absence of a single defining moment. But for those directly involved, it never became just a case. In the years that followed, Carrie eventually began speaking publicly about her experience, not as a recounting of events, but as a reflection on perception and trust. She did not frame her story as exceptional in the sense of uniqueness, but rather as a reminder of how easily ordinary structures of life can contain hidden contradictions that remain invisible until they are no longer sustainable. When she spoke, she did not focus on Lonnie as a person. Instead, she focused on the process of recognition. How subtle inconsistencies accumulate. How intuition often appears before evidence, but is not always trusted. How emotional attachment can delay clarity even when signals are present. What made her perspective resonate with others was not the details of the case itself, but the way she described the gradual erosion of certainty. She emphasized that danger in long-term relationships is rarely visible in a single moment. It often exists in patterns that are only understood in hindsight, once they have already formed into structure. Over time, Carrie's public advocacy shifted toward support for individuals navigating domestic deception and emotional manipulation. Not because her experience could be replicated exactly, but because the psychological process of doubt, confrontation, and realization follows familiar emotional trajectories across different cases. Despite this outward movement, the internal dimension of her experience never fully disappeared. It simply changed form. There were still moments when memory would return without warning, not as narrative but as sensation. A feeling of mismatch between what was believed and what was later revealed. Those moments became less frequent, but they never fully left. What did change was her relationship to them. Instead of interpreting them as disruption, she began to see them as part of integration. Memory was no longer something to resolve, but something to coexist with. The final reflection she often returned to, even privately, was not about Lonnie himself, but about perception. How easily a life can be understood in one way, while simultaneously containing another reality beneath it. How trust, once built, creates its own interpretive framework that can delay recognition of contradiction. And how the mind, in its effort to preserve stability, often resists information that threatens coherence. In the end, the case of Lonnie Keith was not only about criminal behavior or legal consequence. It was also about the distance between appearance and reality in long-term human relationships and the emotional cost of discovering that distance too late. For Carrie, survival did not mean returning to a previous version of life. It meant learning to continue within a new one, where certainty had been replaced by awareness and where the past remained present not as definition, but as context. And in that quiet continuation, without resolution but with understanding, life moved forward, not as it once was, but as it had become. You've already defined a 9-part structure for the script, so there isn't a new narrative segment beyond Part 9. What you're calling Part 10 would actually be an extended epilogue to the aftermath section, basically continuing the psychological and real-world consequences after the case closes. I can do that, but I won't treat it as a new structural chapter. Instead, it will function as a deeper continuation of Part 9, focusing on unresolved emotional impact, prison developments, and long-term ripple effects. Here is the continuation, extended aftermath/epilogue. Years after the courtroom doors closed and the sentence was read, the silence that followed was not peace. It was something heavier, something that settled into the bones of everyone who had touched the case. For Carrie Rogers, life did not simply resume the way people often imagine in stories like this. There was no clean reset, no neat emotional closure wrapped in the finality of a verdict. There were mornings where she woke up and, for a fraction of a second, forgot what had happened. And then the memory returned, not like a thought, but like a physical impact, sharp, immediate, and deeply embodied. Even in the safety of a locked home, there were moments when ordinary sounds became triggers. A floorboard creaking in a quiet hallway. The soft mechanical click of a door settling in its frame. The low hum of a refrigerator late at night when everything else had gone still. These were the kinds of sounds that no one else would notice, but for Carrie they became reminders that safety, once broken in such a fundamental way, never fully returns to its original shape. It adapts, it rebuilds, but it never forgets how it was shattered. She often described it not as fear in the traditional sense, but as anticipation, an unconscious scanning of her environment that never truly shut off. Even in moments of calm, part of her mind remained elsewhere, as if waiting for something that had already happened to happen again. What made the aftermath even more complicated was the emotional contradiction of the man she had once loved. Lonnie was not a stranger she had met on a dark street or a name in a news report. He was the father of her children, the person she had built an entire life around. And that meant the psychological fracture did not end with his arrest. It echoed through family photos, school events, shared memories, and the everyday logistics of raising children who still carried his last name. For the children, the truth came in layers rather than a single moment of revelation. At first, it was confusion, police presence, hushed conversations, adults speaking in careful tones that children instinctively recognize as masking something too large to fully explain. Then came fragments of information, overheard words, news reports glimpsed too early, questions that could not yet be fully answered. Over time, those fragments formed a picture, but never a complete one. And that incompleteness itself became part of their emotional inheritance. Carrie found herself navigating an impossible dual role, survivor of violence and protector of the narrative that would define their understanding of their father. She did not want to erase him from their identity, but she also could not allow denial to become their inheritance. It was a delicate balance between truth and preservation, between honesty and the emotional safety of children who had already lost more than they could articulate. Meanwhile, behind prison walls, Lonnie Keith's presence became something of a psychological paradox within the correctional system. To some, he appeared functional, compliant, articulate, even calm in structured environments. To others, the gravity of his crimes created an invisible barrier that no behavior could fully overcome. In prison reports and informal accounts, there were no dramatic confessions, no public unraveling, only a sustained refusal to fully align with the identity the justice system had assigned to him. That refusal, whether rooted in denial, compartmentalization, or psychological fragmentation, left lingering questions that never found resolution. What troubled investigators most in hindsight was not only the crimes he had been convicted of, but the possibility of unseen patterns, moments of deception that had blended so seamlessly into everyday married life that they were almost indistinguishable from normal conflict. That ambiguity is often what disturbs people most in cases like this. The realization that danger does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it integrates itself into routine, into shared dinners, into family routines, into the mundane architecture of domestic life. For Carrie, that realization was one of the hardest to accept, because it forced her to re-examine not only what had happened, but what she had believed she was seeing at the time. The suspicions she had dismissed, the explanations she had accepted, the moments when intuition whispered something was wrong, only to be overridden by trust, responsibility, and the sheer exhaustion of managing a household with 4 children. In the broader community, the case slowly transformed from active investigation to cautionary memory. It became something discussed in professional circles, referenced in training contexts about domestic violence dynamics, coercive control, and the ways criminal behavior can remain hidden within seemingly stable relationships. But for those directly affected, it was never a case study. It was lived experience, continuing long after headlines faded. Years later, Carrie eventually stepped into advocacy work, not because she had fully healed, but because she had reached a point where silence felt heavier than speech. Speaking publicly meant revisiting moments she would have preferred to leave buried, but it also meant giving structure to chaos, turning private trauma into something that might help others recognize patterns earlier than she had. In those talks, she did not present herself as someone who had all the answers. Instead, she spoke from the fractured space between hindsight and survival, the space where people realize that danger rarely looks like danger until after it has already revealed itself. And perhaps the most enduring truth of the entire case was this: there was no single moment where everything could have been neatly prevented or cleanly understood. There were only accumulated signs, overlapping uncertainties, and the human tendency to rationalize what feels emotionally necessary to believe. In the end, what remained was not closure in the traditional sense, but awareness. A permanent shift in how Carrie understood trust, perception, and the fragile line between the life people present to the world and the life they conceal behind closed doors. And that awareness, painful as it was, became the only form of justice that could continue to grow after the courtroom lights had long gone out. Time has a strange way of editing memory. It does not erase what happened, but it smooths the edges just enough that the world can keep functioning. For Carrie Rogers, that smoothing never fully arrived. Even years after the trial, there were still moments when the past felt less like a memory and more like a place she could accidentally walk back into. Not physically, of course, but emotionally. A certain tone of voice. A specific kind of silence in a room. Even the way a door closes when someone is trying not to be heard. These things carried weight now in a way they never had before. They were no longer neutral details of life. They were signals her body had learned to interpret differently. What outsiders often misunderstand about surviving long-term betrayal and violence is the expectation of moving on. As if life is a road that continues forward in a straight line once a case is resolved. But for Carrie, and for many people who survive similar circumstances, life becomes more like a landscape that has been permanently altered. You do not move on. You move through it, around it, and sometimes alongside it, but it never returns to what it was before. The legal system had done its part. Sentences were handed down. Records were closed. Files were archived. From an institutional perspective, the story had reached its conclusion. But human experience does not obey procedural endings. Inside prison, Lonnie Keith became a subject of quiet discussion among staff and inmates, not because of dramatic behavior, but because of the contradiction he represented. On paper, his life was neatly categorized: physician's assistant, husband, father, convicted offender. But in reality, those categories never fully explained how someone could exist in such conflicting roles without those contradictions becoming visible earlier. Some correctional officers described him as controlled, even subdued in structured environments. Others noted a subtle emotional distance, as if he observed his own circumstances from behind glass. There were no widely reported breakdowns, no dramatic confessions that would neatly satisfy public curiosity. Instead, there was ambiguity, the kind that tends to linger far longer than clarity. And ambiguity is often what unsettles people most, because it denies them a clean moral structure. It forces the uncomfortable recognition that human behavior is not always legible, even to those closest to it. For Carrie, that ambiguity was never something she could comfortably accept. Not because she needed a simple explanation, but because she needed to understand how her perception of reality had been shaped so completely without her awareness. How many moments had she misread? How many explanations had she accepted because they were easier than the alternative? Those questions do not resolve. They accumulate. Her children, as they grew older, began to ask their own versions of those questions, not always directly, sometimes indirectly, in fragments that surfaced during ordinary conversations. A school assignment about family, a friend mentioning something they had overheard, a moment of curiosity that could not be contained once it surfaced. Carrie learned that truth in these situations is not a single disclosure. It is a process, one that must be repeated, adjusted, and carefully timed according to emotional readiness. Each child processed the reality differently, some with anger, some with confusion, some with a quiet withdrawal that worried her more than any emotional outburst. What all of them shared, however, was the need to reconcile two versions of a father, the man who existed in their earliest memories and the man who existed in court documents and prison records. Those two images did not align easily, and forcing them together only created more emotional fragmentation. Carrie often found herself acting as translator between worlds that no longer matched: the past, the present, and the official narrative of the case. But even she could not fully translate what it felt like to live inside that contradiction. In time, the house itself became a kind of emotional archive. Not because of objects or physical reminders, but because of the way memory attached itself to space. Certain rooms carried different emotional temperatures. Certain corners of the home felt heavier at certain times of day. Even years later, she could walk through the house and feel the echo of moments that had never been fully released. Sleep was never entirely uncomplicated. Not because of recurring nightmares in the dramatic sense, but because of hyper-awareness. The kind that does not switch off completely, even during rest. Her mind remained partially oriented towards scanning, assessing, anticipating. It was not fear in its most obvious form. It was adaptation that had outlived its original purpose. And yet, life continued to demand participation. Bills still needed to be paid. Children still needed support. Time still moved forward regardless of emotional readiness. That forced participation slowly became its own form of grounding. Not healing, but structure. One of the most difficult realizations Carrie came to over time was that understanding the past did not necessarily make it less painful. Sometimes understanding only made the shape of the loss more precise. And precision, in emotional terms, can be its own kind of weight. But there were also shifts, subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Moments where the memory of what happened did not immediately collapse her into the past. Moments where she could remember, without reliving. Those moments did not arrive as breakthroughs. They arrived as brief interruptions in the cycle of emotional repetition. And over time, those interruptions became slightly more frequent. Outside of her immediate life, the case continued to be referenced in professional circles dealing with domestic violence, coercive control, and hidden criminal behavior within intimate relationships. Not as a sensational story, but as an example of how deeply violence can embed itself within normalcy without immediate detection. What experts often emphasize in analyzing such cases is not the idea of missing signs in a simplistic sense, but rather the way human beings are conditioned to normalize gradual escalation. Trust builds incrementally. Doubt builds slowly. And when the two exist simultaneously, trust often wins by default until overwhelming evidence forces a reassessment. That is part of what made Carrie's experience so psychologically complex. It was not a single moment of deception, but a long sequence of reinterpretations, each one reasonable on its own, each one building on the last until the final truth made the earlier interpretations feel almost surreal in hindsight. Years later, when Carrie spoke publicly, she did not frame her experience as something she had overcome in a complete sense. Instead, she described it as something she had learned to integrate into her life without allowing it to define every part of it. That distinction mattered, because it reflected a reality that many survivors recognize but rarely articulate publicly. Some experiences do not end. They are carried differently over time. In quieter moments, she sometimes reflected on how easily life can split into two parallel narratives, the one people see from the outside and the one lived internally. Before everything happened, those two narratives had felt aligned. Afterward, they never fully reconnected in the same way again. And yet, within that fragmentation, there was still forward motion. Not dramatic, not linear, but persistent. What remains at the end of cases like this is not resolution in the cinematic sense. There is no final emotional scene where everything is neatly restored. Instead, there is adaptation. A life rebuilt not by returning to what existed before, but by constructing something new around what cannot be removed. For Carrie, that meant learning how to exist with memory without being consumed by it. Learning how to recognize warning signs without living in constant anticipation of them. Learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to trust again, not blindly but carefully, with awareness of what had been learned through loss. And perhaps the most honest conclusion to the story is this: survival is not defined by the absence of pain afterward. It is defined by the continued decision to remain present in a life that has been permanently changed by it. In the years that followed, what surprised Carrie Rogers most was not the persistence of pain, but its unpredictability. There was no schedule to it, no warning system that signaled when the past would return with force. It could happen in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, while doing something as simple as folding laundry or listening to the distant sound of children laughing outside. A moment completely disconnected from violence, yet suddenly occupied by it. But just as unpredictably, there were also moments when the memory of what had happened felt distant enough to observe rather than relive. Not gone, never gone, but no longer sharp enough to cut through everything else. That shift did not feel like healing in the way people often imagine it. It felt more like recalibration, as if her nervous system, after years of being locked in a state of vigilance, had slowly learned that not every silence concealed danger, not every absence meant something was wrong. Still, trust never returned in its original form. It evolved into something more deliberate, something chosen rather than assumed. Where once trust had been automatic, it now required time, consistency, and observation. That change was not something she resented. It was something she understood as necessary. Her life, outwardly, continued to function in ways that might appear ordinary to anyone looking in from the outside. Work, family responsibilities, daily routines. But beneath that surface, there was a different kind of awareness running quietly in parallel. Not fear exactly, but attentiveness. A sharpened sense of the subtle differences between what is said and what is meant, between presence and performance. The legal resolution of the case had long since been absorbed into public record, but in her personal life, it never fully became history. It remained something more like a reference point, a dividing line between who she was before and who she became after. That division did not define her entire identity, but it remained part of its architecture. Her children, now older, carried their own versions of that history. Each of them had built a relationship with the past that was separate from hers, shaped not only by what they experienced, but by how they interpreted it over time. Some questions faded. Others resurfaced in new forms. There were moments when they sought clarity she could not fully provide, not because she was withholding anything, but because some parts of human behavior resist complete explanation. That was one of the hardest truths she had come to accept. Understanding does not always equal closure. Sometimes understanding only expands the space where uncertainty lives. There were anniversaries she did not mark publicly, but felt internally. Dates that existed in memory without needing to be acknowledged on calendars. On those days, she would sometimes find herself unusually quiet, not out of sadness alone, but out of reflection. A kind of internal accounting that no longer required words. Over time, she noticed something else too. The intensity of emotional flashbacks began to soften. Not disappear, but lose some of their immediacy. The body still remembered, but it no longer reacted with the same urgency. That change was subtle enough that she almost missed it at first. But once noticed, it became one of the few signs that time was doing something it had not done before. Not erasing, but redistributing weight. There was a point years later when she realized that she could speak about what had happened without feeling like she was being pulled back into it. The story remained difficult, but it was no longer consuming in the same way. That distinction mattered more than it might have sounded to others. Because for a long time, speaking about it and reliving it had been the same experience. In public spaces where she shared her story, she often encountered people searching for a single lesson, a single warning sign they could extract and apply universally. But she never offered that simplicity because she knew it did not exist. Instead, she spoke about patterns, about gradual shifts in behavior that are easy to rationalize in isolation, about how emotional investment can quietly reframe what should otherwise feel alarming, and about how hindsight always looks cleaner than lived experience. What stayed with her most was not the violence itself, but the contrast between what had once felt normal and what she now understood had been hidden beneath it. That contrast could never be fully resolved. It simply became part of how she interpreted the world. Even so, she did not define her entire identity through what happened. That would have been another kind of confinement. Instead, she allowed it to exist as one part of a larger life that continued to unfold beyond it. A life that still contained moments of laughter, routine, connection, and quiet stability. Moments that did not cancel the past, but existed alongside it. And perhaps that is the final truth that cases like this leave behind, long after investigations end and courtrooms fall silent. Not a sense of completion, but a deeper understanding of complexity. The recognition that people are not easily categorized, that danger can exist within familiarity, and that survival is not a single moment of escape, but a continuous process of rebuilding meaning in a world that has already proven it can change without warning. For Carrie Rogers, that rebuilding never ended in a dramatic conclusion. It simply became life itself.